Friday night, while thousands of people in Naples were out in the streets celebrating the 100th anniversary of their beloved football club, SSC Napoli, the ground underneath the city's western edge suddenly let go. A magnitude 4.7 earthquake tore through the Campi Flegrei volcanic area at 7:46 in the evening, and within seconds, celebration turned into panic. Boulders broke loose from hillsides and crushed parked cars in the street. Power went out across several neighborhoods, and on the island of Procida, train service across the entire Naples network shut down. The port of Pozzuoli closed, cutting off ferry access to Procida and Ischia. And by the time the night was over, more than 60 aftershocks had rattled the same stretch of coastline, some strong enough to send families out of their homes to sleep in their cars. This was officially the strongest earthquake recorded in this specific volcanic region in more than 40 years. I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means, and because I know the headline promised you this, what scientists actually say about the eruption question, rather than what a dramatic title implies. Let's get into it. The earthquake struck at 7:46 p.m. local time on Friday, July 31st, with its epicenter located near the Solfatara crater, between the towns of Pozzuoli and Cordo, just a few kilometers west of central Naples. Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known by its Italian acronym INGV, confirmed the depth at roughly 3 kilometers, genuinely shallow, which is a big part of why the shaking felt so violent and so close to the surface for everyone who experienced it. The tremor was felt clearly across Pozzuoli and Boccoli, through the western districts of Naples, including Bagnoli and Fuorigrotta, and all the way into the city center where those SSC Napoli centenary celebrations were underway. It was also felt on the islands of Procida and Ischia, out in the bay. The human toll from Friday night has been reported a little differently across various outlets as the picture has continued to develop, with figures ranging from at least 21 to at least 26 people injured. At least 18 families were evacuated from damaged buildings, though some reporting suggests the real number of displaced residents runs into the hundreds once you account for people who left voluntarily rather than under a formal evacuation order. Some structures were damaged badly enough to be described as beyond repair. Rail service across the Naples metropolitan network was suspended, with delays running past 6 hours on regional lines. The port of Pozzuoli closed entirely, severing ferry service to Procida and Ischia for residents and the tourists currently filling the region during peak summer season. And in a detail that captures just how physically violent this earthquake was, falling boulders dislodged from the area's characteristic volcanic terrain came down onto city streets and crushed multiple parked cars. What followed the main shock was, in some ways, just as significant as the earthquake itself. INGV confirmed more than 60 aftershocks in the hours afterward, with the strongest, a magnitude 3.8, striking around 10 p.m. that same night in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, followed by another magnitude 3.1 early Saturday morning. Local residents described more than 30 distinct tremors through the course of the evening alone. Italy's Civil Protection Minister, Nello Musumeci, addressed the public directly, confirming that the seismic swarm was still ongoing and that further earthquakes above magnitude 3 remained a real possibility in the days ahead. Rather than return to their homes, many families spent the night sleeping in their cars or gathered at emergency assembly points set up by Italy's Civil Protection Department, a level of caution that tells you a lot about how seriously both residents and officials were treating Friday night, even without any formal eruption warning being issued. Now let's talk about why this specific stretch of Italian coastline produces earthquakes like this in the first place, because it's genuinely different from most of the earthquake stories I've covered on this channel. Campi Flegrei, which translates roughly to burning fields, is a vast volcanic caldera sitting about 9 kilometers west of central Naples and roughly 50 kilometers from Italy's other, far more famous volcano, Mount Vesuvius. I want to be clear about that distinction up front. Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius are separate, independent volcanic systems. They don't share a magma chamber, and activity at one doesn't drive activity at the other, even though they sit relatively close together and both threaten the same densely populated stretch of Italian coastline. Vesuvius is the volcano most people know from history class, responsible for the eruption that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in the year 79. But it hasn't erupted since 1944 and isn't showing anything close to the kind of unrest Campi Flegrei is currently experiencing. If you see coverage of this week's earthquake that seems to conflate the two volcanoes, that's worth treating with some skepticism, since they're genuinely distinct geological features with their own separate monitoring records. It's also worth noting the timing here, since this earthquake struck squarely in the middle of peak summer tourist season along the Bay of Naples, one of Italy's busiest travel corridors. Procida and Ischia, both cut off from ferry service by the port closure, are popular island destinations that were packed with visitors when the earthquake hit, and the sudden loss of both rail and ferry access left a lot of tourists scrambling to figure out alternate routes in the immediate aftermath. Local tourism officials have been quick to note that Naples itself remains open, and that this kind of disruption, while genuinely inconvenient, is a manageable temporary infrastructure issue, rather than a sign that the broader region is unsafe to visit, though anyone with travel plans to the immediate Pozzuoli and Solfatara area in the coming days should expect to check transit status before heading out. Campi Flegrei has been in an active, accelerating phase of something called Bradyseism since 2005. Bradyseism describes a slow, ongoing rise and fall of the ground surface driven by the movement of magmatic fluids and gases underneath the caldera, without those fluids necessarily reaching the surface as an actual eruption. Think of it almost like a very slow-motion breathing pattern in the crust itself. As pressure builds beneath Pozzuoli, the ground gradually swells upward, and as that pressure vents off or shifts, it can gradually subside again. Since this current phase of unrest began in 2005, the ground near Pozzuoli has risen by more than 140 centimeters, well over 4 feet of cumulative uplift. As of INGV's most recent routine monitoring update, covering the week just before this earthquake, the ground was still rising at a rate of about 10 millimeters per month, alongside geochemical readings showing a long-term trend of the underground hydrothermal system heating up and releasing more fluid. Here's the direct link between that slow uplift and Friday night's violent shaking. As the ground beneath Pozzuoli swells, it puts genuine mechanical stress on the rock layers above and around the source of that pressure, and eventually the rock cracks and shifts to accommodate the deformation, which is exactly what produces an earthquake. This is a fundamentally different earthquake mechanism than what I've covered in other videos, tied to tectonic plates grinding past each other or diving beneath one another. This is volcanic and hydrothermal in origin, driven by fluid and gas pressure changes deep underground, rather than the movement of entire continental plates. It's also why these earthquakes tend to arrive in dense swarms, dozens or even over 100 events clustered within hours or days, rather than the more spread out main shock and aftershock pattern you'd see from a typical tectonic earthquake. It's worth understanding how scientists actually track a slow, ongoing process like Bradyseism, since it's a genuinely different monitoring challenge than watching a single tectonic fault. INGV relies on a dense network of GPS stations planted around the caldera that can detect ground movement down to just a few millimeters, letting researchers map exactly how much the surface has risen or fallen and where that deformation is centered, essentially in real time. That's combined with satellite radar techniques capable of measuring ground deformation across the entire caldera from orbit, and with direct sampling of gases escaping from fumaroles, the steaming vents scattered across the Solfatara crater area, since changes in the chemistry and temperature of those gases can signal shifts in the underground hydrothermal system well before those shifts show up as either uplift or earthquakes. Combining all three data streams, ground position, satellite deformation mapping, and gas geochemistry, is what lets INGV distinguish a genuine acceleration in the system from ordinary short-term noise. And it's exactly the kind of layered monitoring that let them describe conditions as comparably calm just 2 weeks before Friday's earthquake, based on real, specific measurements rather than a guess. I also want to give you a sense of just how quickly the bar for worst in decades has been moving here, because I think it's one of the more striking parts of this story. Friday's magnitude 4.7 wasn't an isolated spike out of nowhere. It's the latest and largest event in a swarm that INGV data shows started weekly back in 2015 and intensified significantly starting in 2023, arriving in a series of escalating pulses. Go back to March of 2025, and a magnitude 4.4 earthquake near Pozzuoli was, at the time, described as the strongest in 40 years, preceded by a loud underground roar and followed by its own swarm of smaller tremors. Then, just 3 months later in June of 2025, a magnitude 4.6 earthquake broke that record. This past May, a shallow magnitude, 4.4, struck offshore between the Pozzuoli and Boccoli sectors of the caldera, kicking off a distinct swarm of 12 earthquakes over the course of a single morning before that particular sequence tapered off. And now, in July of 2026, Friday's magnitude 4.7 has broken the record again. 3 separate strongest in 40 years headlines within a span of about 16 months isn't a coincidence or a media exaggeration. It's a genuinely accurate description of a trend that keeps climbing even though each individual record has only been broken by a relatively small margin. So let's get to the question. The title of this video is built around, could Campi Flegrei actually erupt? I want to answer this carefully, because it's exactly the kind of question where a sensational framing and the actual scientific reality can pull in different directions. As of the most recent statements from Italian officials, there's been no declaration of an imminent eruption risk, despite this intensifying swarm. Civil Protection Minister Musumeti's warning was about the continuation of seismic activity itself, more earthquakes above magnitude 3 remaining possible, not a specific eruption warning. That's an important distinction. INGV's own routine monitoring report from just before this earthquake, covering the week of July 13th through 19th, described the caldera's activity as comparably calm, with only a handful of very small earthquakes recorded, ongoing but steady ground uplift, and concluded that no significant short-term changes were anticipated. Friday night's earthquake clearly represents an acceleration beyond what that report anticipated, and that's exactly why it's a real, legitimate news story. But an accelerating trend in earthquake swarms and ground deformation is not the same thing as a confirmed or imminent eruption, and Italian and international volcanologists have been careful, consistently, not to conflate the two. It's also worth understanding what an actual eruption at Campi Flegrei would most likely look like, because the word supervolcano tends to conjure an image that doesn't match what scientists are actually watching for. Campi Flegrei does carry that supervolcano label for a real, historical reason. Roughly 39,000 years ago, it produced the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in Europe over the past 250,000 years. An eruption so massive it helped carve out the caldera structure that still shapes this landscape today. But nobody monitoring this system is currently watching for a repeat of that ancient civilization-altering super eruption. The far more relevant historical comparison is Campi Flegrei's most recent actual eruption, which happened in 1538, when an entirely new volcanic cone, now called Monte Nuovo, formed near Pozzuoli over the course of just a few days. That 1538 eruption was preceded by exactly the pattern we're watching unfold right now, accelerating ground uplift and an intensifying earthquake swarm in the weeks and months beforehand. If Campi Flegrei does eventually erupt again, the working scientific expectation is that it would far more likely resemble a localized, comparatively modest event like 1538, rather than a repeat of the ancient super eruption that gives this caldera its dramatic reputation. That's not a guarantee, and it's not a reason to dismiss the current unrest, but it is a meaningfully different, more calibrated picture than supervolcano eruption. Headlines tend to suggest on their own. None of that makes the current situation something to shrug off, though, and Italian authorities clearly aren't treating it that way. Roughly 500,000 people live within the caldera's 15 municipalities, an area officially designated as the high-risk red zone, and the wider Naples metropolitan area is home to close to 3 million people total. That combination, a genuinely active volcanic system sitting directly beneath one of the most densely populated regions in Europe, is exactly why Italy has spent years developing one of the most detailed volcanic evacuation plans anywhere in the world. Specifically for this caldera, covering everything from designated evacuation routes to reception areas outside the region, for residents who'd need to relocate on short notice if the situation ever escalated toward an actual eruption warning. That planning effort is worth understanding in a bit more detail, because it reflects just how seriously this specific volcanic threat has been taken by Italian civil authorities for decades, long before this particular swarm began. The Red Zone plan divides the at-risk population into groups tied to specific municipalities, each pre-assigned a matching partner region elsewhere in Italy that has agreed in advance to receive evacuees, along with pre-identified transportation routes, assembly points, and even specific rail and ferry capacity set aside for a mass evacuation scenario. The plan exists precisely because Campi Flegrei presents an unusually difficult evacuation challenge compared to most volcanoes. Unlike a single or tall, isolated peak, where the hazard zone is relatively easy to define, Campi Flegrei's caldera is broad, low-lying, densely built up, and threaded through with some of Naples' most congested urban infrastructure, meaning a genuine evacuation order would need to move hundreds of thousands of people through road and rail networks that are already routinely overloaded on an ordinary day. None of that planning has been activated as anything beyond a standing framework right now. It exists specifically so that it doesn't have to be improvised from scratch if conditions ever do escalate that far. It's also worth explaining briefly how scientists think about the days and weeks immediately following an earthquake like Friday's, since it's a similar statistical exercise to the aftershock forecasting I've walked through in earthquake videos elsewhere in the world, just applied to a volcanic rather than tectonic setting. When INGV and Italy's Civil Protection Department say further magnitude 3+ earthquakes remain possible, that's grounded in how this specific swarm, and similar swarms at Campi Flegrei historically, have behaved in the days following a notable spike in activity, not a specific prediction of exactly when or where the next earthquake will strike. Swarms like this one can behave in genuinely different ways from here. Some taper off within days as the underlying pressure finds a new temporary equilibrium, while others continue producing notable events for weeks before settling down. The honest answer, the same one I try to give you in every video like this, is that nobody can tell you today which of those paths this particular swarm is going to take. What INGV can do, and has been doing continuously since 2005, is keep measuring the actual ground movement, seismicity, and gas chemistry in real time, which is a far more reliable guide than trying to guess based on how dramatic Friday night felt in the moment. For residents actually living through this right now, the immediate concerns are much more practical than a hypothetical eruption. If your building took damage Friday night, getting a structural inspection before returning is a genuinely important step, not an overreaction, especially with more aftershocks still considered possible. Given the falling rock hazard already reported this weekend, it's also worth being extra cautious around steep or exposed terrain in the immediate area, since aftershocks can dislodge additional loose material that survived the main shock. If you're relying on rail or ferry service in the area, expect continued disruptions until infrastructure crews confirm everything is safe to fully reopen, and check the status of your specific route directly rather than assuming service has resumed. And if you live in the red zone and don't already know your household's specific evacuation route and assembly point under Italy's civil protection planning, this is exactly the kind of week to look that up, regardless of whether an actual eruption ever becomes a realistic near-term concern. A well-prepared household doesn't need to believe an eruption is imminent to benefit from knowing its evacuation plan in advance. The same way, knowing your nearest exit in an unfamiliar building is just good practice regardless of whether you expect to ever need it. If you're a tourist currently in the Naples area or with upcoming travel plans there, it's worth building some flexibility into your itinerary around Pozzuoli, Boccoli, and the Solfatara crater area specifically, until transit services are confirmed to be fully back online, while recognizing that the broader Naples region, including the city center and most of the coastline, remains open and functioning. Traveling with a fully charged phone and knowing how to reach your accommodation or embassy if communication networks get strained is reasonable general precaution in any region experiencing this kind of active seismic activity, not a sign that you should cancel plans altogether. I also want to say something about how to think about headlines like the one on this video, because I chose to use it deliberately, in quotation marks, precisely because it's the kind of framing you're going to see a lot of over the next few days as this story spreads. It could erupt is, in a narrow technical sense, true. Campi Flegrei is an active volcanic system, and active volcanic systems can, by definition, erupt. But that phrase does a lot of work to imply immediacy that the actual monitoring data doesn't currently support. The responsible version of this story is the one I've tried to give you, a genuinely significant record-breaking earthquake, part of a real, well-documented, years-long trend of intensifying unrest, being taken seriously by scientists and officials alike, without a declared imminent eruption threat as of right now. Both of those things can be true at once, and I think that's a more useful place to leave you than either extreme. It's also worth remembering that Campi Flegrei has been in this same general state of watchful, escalating unrest for roughly 2 decades now, and previous record-breaking earthquakes in 2025 didn't lead directly to an eruption either, which isn't a guarantee about how this current phase resolves, but it is a useful reminder that worst in decades and eruption imminent are 2 genuinely different claims even when they show up in the same news cycle. I'll be watching how this swarm evolves over the coming days, whether the aftershock sequence tapers off the way these sequences typically do, or whether it continues producing notable events the way Minister Musumeci warned it might. I'll also be keeping an eye on INGV's next routine monitoring updates, since their assessment just before this earthquake was that nothing significant was expected in the short term, and it'll be worth watching how their read on the situation changes now that a new record has been set. If you want to check conditions yourself between videos, INGV publishes regular public bulletins on Campi Flegrei activity, and they're a far more reliable source than social media speculation for anyone genuinely trying to track this situation as it develops. If anything meaningfully shifts, whether that's the swarm calming down or escalating further, I'll bring you an update grounded in what INGV and Italy's Civil Protection Department are actually saying, not in whatever headline is generating the most attention that day. Stay informed. Follow official Italian sources if you want real-time updates, and I'll see you in the next one.